Welcome. The nation has a long history of supporting student journalism. Our Student Nation writing program has published hundreds of talented young reporters, most writing for the first time for a national publication. Our annual conferences have helped introduce and train the next generation of progressive journalists. And our fellowship programs have helped identify, cultivate, and nurture dozens of young editors and writers. Now, thanks to the great generosity of the Puffin Foundation, we're launching a new series of on-demand video trainings to help support the strong appetite young journalists have for practical tools of the trade. The first one features the inimitable investigative reporter, Ken Klippenstein, explaining why FOIA journalism is so critical and how it can be done successfully. The Freedom of Information Act, better known as FOIA, is one of the most important legal tools citizens and reporters have for furthering government transparency in the United States. It's a great way to expose government secrecy and abuse, and we at the nation have always strongly encouraged its use. Since its establishment in 1967, FOIA has been critical in exposing waste, fraud, and government abuse. FOIA replaced a, quote, need to know standard with a, quote, right to know threshold, putting a burden on the government to show that requested information should not be disclosed, rather than assuming the government always had good reason to withhold data from the public. FOIA law, or FOIA law, provides the ability to request records from the federal government as well as most public bodies in each state. That includes everything from school districts, police departments, park districts, mayor's offices, and transportation departments. Private citizens, as well as journalists, can submit FOIA requests. In December 2021, a group of scientists and medical researchers successfully sued the FDA under FOIA to force release of hundreds of thousands of documents related to licensing of the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine. In Chicago, the state FOIA statute has had some high-profile moments, including the release of the police video from the night a white Chicago police officer killed Black teenager Laquan McDonald. Writing in January 2022 in The Nation, Claire McDougall described how Guantanamo is still a black hole of secrecy. But by filing countless FOIA requests, FOIA, McDougall and other journalists and academics have been able to help shape the public record on the prison that the United States government has tried to hide from public view. Investigative reporter Jason Leopold has filed 325 FOIA requests related to Guantanamo, many focused on the abuse treatment of detainees. One of the country's most effective practitioners of FOIA journalism currently is Ken Klippenstein, a DC-based investigative reporter for the Intercept, focuses on national security, government secrecy, corporate controversies. He's an avid Freedom of Information Act requester and one of the country's foremost investigative data journalists. During the George Floyd protests, Klippenstein's reporting uncovered documents regarding federal policing of the protests. Specifically, Klippenstein obtained an FBI document that stated the Washington field office, quote, has no intelligence, including Antifa involvement or presence during DC area protests in contradiction to Attorney General William Barr and other officials' assertions that Antifa was specifically responsible for instigating violence. He also reported that contacts working at the Department of Homeland Security were disgruntled about orders to generate internal intelligence reports on journalists covering protests in Portland, Oregon, as well as participating activists. Prior to joining The Intercept, I'm proud to say Ken was the nation's DC correspondent. I think you'll agree that his tips and trainings are invaluable. I hope you enjoy this video and share it widely. Thank you.
Okay, so FOIA stands for the Freedom of Information Act. It's a federal law wherein anyone, you don't have to be a US citizen even, can request government records and get copies of those records back. Now, there are a number of exemptions. There are certain reasons that they might not produce them, but the idea is that in general, if the government produces a record, as a member of the society, as a potentially a taxpayer, as someone with a stake in the governance of the United States, you have a right to see what that is. And this can be a really cool sort of asymmetric tool to turn back around the government some of the most secretive agencies this law applies to: the Central Intelligence Agency, the FBI, the Defense Department, the Health and Human Services. Virtually any federal body you can ask for these records, and they have to produce them to you. This can be a very useful tool for getting primary source documents to provide insight into what these agencies are really doing, so you don't have to rely on the sort of anonymous sources or individuals within the agencies who, in my reporting, I certainly rely on them, but they come to you with all sorts of biases and allegiances. I mean, they're parts of the agency, and that's going to color the insights that they're able to bring you. And so if you get these documents, I always call them the receipts. These are the primary sources right from the horse's mouth. You can see what they're saying on a policy basis. That can really help to inform a fact-based reporting that I think can act as a sort of bulwark against what people have come to see the media as at its worst, which is very opinion-based and biased and distorted. You show them primary source documents, it doesn't matter what your personal political preferences are or where you're coming from. These are the words right from the agency's own mouth. And so I find that it helps a lot with getting around readers' preconceived notions about who you are, what media is, so on and so forth. You don't have to debate, you don't have to analyze or offer an opinion on anything. You can just rely on what the documents themselves say and let people come to their own conclusions. So the way that it works in practice, there's a bit of a learning curve in that, while most of these documents you technically can get under the law and you're supposed to be able to, there's often a long wait list for receiving these documents. So you can look at agencies like the Department of State or components of the Department of Defense. They have months and even years long backlogs, FOIA backlogs, and this is a recurring problem. The reason for this is that they don't fund FOIA well, I submit, because it's a dangerous tool. You can use it to shed light on some of the most secretive corners of government, and not just secretive ones, but parts of government where they just don't want the public to know a whole lot about what they're doing. And so naturally, when you have a situation like that, why would they want to finance it and give you the keys to the castle? So the law is pretty reasonable. It's the application, it's the implementation of that law that's run into a lot of problems, where they've just defunded it to the point that these FOIA agencies don't have the necessary resources to be able to field the number of requests they're getting, and they're getting more now than they ever have at any point in the past, which in a certain sense is encouraging, because it shows that citizens are getting engaged and learning how to assert their rights and trying to learn about these agencies. But the downside of that is that there's not been a commensurate response by the agencies to resource these FOIA offices to be able to handle the sheer volume of requests that are coming in. So a lot of the learning curve around federal FOIA is figuring out how to get your request to the front of the line. There's two different lines. It's called the complex track and the simple track. If you can get your request in what's called the simple track, you're off to the races, because at that point, the Justice Department and I can't remember, every agency, they release statistics at the end of the year to the Congress to try to say, look at us, look how transparent we are, look at all these records we're producing, we're doing well. And if you look at those, it gives you a breakdown often of how quick the response time is for these different tracks. And so if you're able to get in the simple track, they're going to produce that to you in a matter of days or weeks, as opposed to the complex track, which is going to be a matter of weeks and months. So a lot of strategy in FOIA is trying to get in that simple track. The way you go about doing that is knowing exactly what you want to ask for. With novice requesters who reach out for advice, what I often find is that they have very broad requests. They're like, I'd like to know everything about the Iranian Revolution, or I'd like to know everything about the CIA's role in the drone program. Those are, from the perspective of a FOIA records custodian, that's not going to be a real easy thing to fulfill. I mean, these guys are not librarians where they're going to go around and research things and come back to you with a whole stack of files and records to answer your question. They are going to be looking for any reason to basically remand your request to that complex track so that they can say, oh, it's too complicated, we don't have the resources to do it, so we're going to put it here and make you wait 5, 6, 7 years. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. The wait really is that long if you get remanded to the complex track. So it's very much in your interest to know what it is you're asking about. Something I always say is that we don't really have a Freedom of Information Act. It's a bit of a misnomer. We have a Freedom of Records Act, because if you and this is how a lot of people approach FOIA. They come to it with this kind of good faith understanding, thinking, oh, freedom of information, well, I can just ask them my question and they can answer it. But under the law, they're not required to answer any sort of questions. They're not required to do any research. All they're required to do is produce specific records that you ask for, and you have to specify what they are. And if you can't, then they're under very little obligation to produce anything. So there's a big research component to FOIA that I think a lot of people don't appreciate. I don't send requests out blind. If you want to find out about something, the best thing to do is start researching and figuring out, okay, what kind of documents and what are they called that are going to correspond to the information that I want. And there's a wealth of resources for finding those things out. There's other FOIA requests that are posted online that you can just Google. One of the most fruitful avenues for me has been to talk to retired folks from whatever the agency is and say, hey, I'll give you an example. I was doing a FOIA request to the State Department because Trump's first foreign visit was to Saudi Arabia, and it was very unusual because every other president, their first foreign visit is to a neighboring country, either Canada or Mexico. And so I thought, well, that's strange, going to Saudi Arabia. What was that trip like? And I thought, they usually shower them with gifts, particularly the Saudi regime. So I'm thinking, how would I find a list of those gifts that might be insightful and tell us about their relationship? So I talked to somebody who used to work at the State Department as a diplomat, and she explained to me, she said, oh, there's a gifts registry in what's called a very obscure office I'd never heard of before, called the Office of the Chief of Protocol. No way I would have known what this was unless I spoke to this retired diplomat. So then I start Googling, and turns out she's right. There's Office of Chief of Protocol produces an itemized list of all gifts, because the president is required to report those, and members of the cabinet whenever they receive them from a foreign government. So I sent out a FOIA request for that, got it back in maybe 5 weeks or so, not super prompt, but still quick enough for it to be within the news cycle. And I'm reporting it, and the list of gifts was just cartoonish. It was like, gold coins and swords and daggers and guns and things. It was crazy. But that's something that I never would have thought to ask for in the manner in which I asked, unless I had spoken to this retired diplomat. So there's a big human component to FOIA. It's not just, writing up what you'd like. It's not a Christmas list. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. You've got to figure out how to word it. And once you've got it worded in a way that's specific enough that it makes it hard for them to say, oh, I don't know what they're talking about, that's really when FOIA is going to produce the best sort of results for you. Yeah, so with FOIA results may vary, as they say. National security agencies are going to be the toughest ones because they can invoke state secrets privileges, national security privileges, and those are interpreted very broadly by the courts and by the federal government generally. So I'm not saying don't do it. That's the lion's share of my own FOIA work is to national security agencies, but that probably has the steepest learning curve. Whereas other agencies like, say, the Health and Human Services, EPA, I'm not saying the information is not important, but it's not going to be guarded with it's not going to be guarded in quite the same zealous fashion, let's say, as the national security agencies, or say the Small Business Administration, or the IRS or something. Those types of sort of domestic economic agencies tend to not just be easier to deal with generally, but they have shorter backlogs. If you want to know how responsive a agency that you're interested in is, you can just Google the FOIA backlog, and it should have a year-by-year breakdown of how big their backlog is, what their typical response time is, and that'll give you a sense. And I really encourage people, I don't think that this is obvious to folks when they're starting out with this, but just talking to the FOIA officers. These are often pretty nice people. They don't have the sorts of interests that you think of as wanting to keep everything secret. Now, they work for people who want to keep things secret, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they themselves will have internalized that. And if you try to word it in your correspondence with them, either on the phone or via email, and I would encourage people to try to get on the phone with people. I know that younger folks don't like the phone; they're very phone phobic, but that could be a very useful way to communicate with FOIA officers because they know it's not being written down anywhere, and then they don't have to be worried about what they're saying, turning up in a story somewhere, or perhaps getting FOIA'd, which you can FOIA officers as well. They tend to be a lot more candid if you get them on the phone. And if you try to word it like, and I think this is honest, try to word it like, I'm trying to make this request as simple as possible so that it's easy for you to fulfill, they're going to have an incentive to help you because one of their incentives, one of their biggest ones, is to be able to go to Congress at the end of the year and say, look at how many of these things we fulfilled. We're so open, we care about transparency. Despite this massive backlog, we're actually doing a lot of things. And if you think about it, what's the easiest way for them to maximize this number that they're going to go to Congress with at the end of the year is making it the easiest requests possible, making requests that are going to be 2 or 3 or 4 pages long of documents they're going to give you back, telling them exactly where they're located, explaining to them why the exemptions don't apply, just making a really easy case for them to go and make the case either to their boss or if they're making the call themselves to go ahead and produce those documents and say, wow, this is a really quick and easy thing for me to get 5 more pages towards our grand total that we end up showing to Congress. So that I'm trying to give you guys a sense of what their interests, what their incentives are. And in this case, I think they overlap with those of a journalist because, you want things quickly. And if you can formulate a request that's going to get them quickly, then that can really be to your benefit. And they're not as sort of cagey and politically minded as you might think. Just try to get them on the phone, talk to them. They're people just like us, and sometimes they're quite friendly. The vast majority of requests are not actually from journalists. This is a big misconception. The vast majority of requests are commercial in nature. So when you file a request, make clear that you work for a journalistic institution because you can get fee waivers. That is, you can get your request processed for free, as opposed to a commercial requester that's doing it in their commercial interest, which is all sorts of this. So the most common request is going to be from a business entity trying to collect information for whatever they're, for furthering their profits, business intelligence. You can go through what are called FOIL logs, Google FOIL log, FOIA request log for whatever agency you want. You can scroll through the requests. Vast majority of requests are going to be ExxonMobil wants to know about some contract opportunity that the Defense Department maybe has, so that they can try to win contracts or something like that. So if you get on the phone with a FOIA officer, you might even seem sort of exotic. It's like, oh, look, a young journalist, they're trying to find their way. That's nice. And you often find they're pretty nice people, and you can find some in common where I'm sure it's more interesting for them to talk to a reporter than it is for them to just talk to some business analyst that's working on these kind of things. But yeah, unfortunately, requests in the public interest form the minority of these information requests. And of course, private industry it comprises a lot of the backlog that we're seeing in just the profuse amount of requests that exist. So understand that when you call in, they're not necessarily thinking, oh, here's some journalist trying to poke around for the big scoop. You're in the minority when you're talking to them, and that can be beneficial. It does matter. Under President Obama, he issued an executive order that instructed federal agencies to come to these requests from the presumption of openness. That is to say, assuming that the number one value here is transparency. And if you're going to make a case against releasing records, then it goes against that presumption. Now, we're all adults here. There are limits to, what that's going to mean on a practical level. They're not going to start, releasing all sorts of things that are going to incriminate the agency. But, it means something. I would say that between agencies, it perhaps means less than you might think. So, for example, from President Obama to President Trump, they had many of the same FOIA chief officers. So, for example, David Hardy is head of the records division at the FBI. He was head of the records division under Obama. He was head of the records division under Trump. So I would say there's certainly a difference, no question about it. Things were less open under President Trump than under President Obama, as far as I can tell, and I think there's empirical evidence to suggest that as well. But it means less than one might think. On the other hand, there are sort of political considerations. For example, when I got that list of the gifts from Saudi Arabia, I was informed after receiving that President Trump had moved a lot of longtime diplomats to the FOIA office. And I don't have direct knowledge of if they were involved in my particular quest, but I had heard that there were sort of more rambunctious attitudes in the FOIA office after they had put out these very experienced and intelligent diplomats to pasture because Trump had feared some kind of liberal, conspiracy against him. He put him in the FOIA office, and you're someone who has a lot of valuable skills, and you didn't do anything wrong, so you're probably going to be angry and willing to help folks that are digging around and trying to find out what Trump is up to. So that was a dynamic that I was told existed in that office, and I imagine that exists between agencies. It's important to understand that these institutions are not monolithic. There are people within them that have their own goals, that have their own set of motives and political attitudes, may even agree with you on things. And for that reason, I think it's really important to try to talk to as many people as possible, because you never know who you're going to find that might be sympathetic to your cause. So you might be wondering, does it matter what party is in the White House? And is that going to affect how FOIA requests are processed, how much openness there is, the types of records that they decide to apply these principles of openness to? My answer to that would be a qualified yes. It would be a yes, but. It does matter, but not quite as much as you might think. Yeah, so I've had all kinds of sundry FOIA experience, not just at the federal level, but every state has its own interpretation of FOIA that governs state and local, that is non-federal records requests. So for example, you've got the Florida Open Records Act, you've got the California Sunshine Act, you've got the Illinois Freedom of Information Act. Each of these laws, if you want to learn about them, because they vary sometimes in important respects, I would just Google MUCROC FOIA guide and then the state that you're looking at. It'll give you a very nice summarized rundown of the pertinent points. That is, what their deadlines are you able to ask for a public interest waiver, do you have to identify yourself as a member of the news media? A really nice summary of what you need to know when doing those sorts of requests. I would say the FOIA story that I'm most proud of would be the last one that I did for The Nation, which was actually a collection of a bunch of different FOIA requests I had filed at the state level to try to find out about these institutions called fusion centers. These are state law enforcement and intelligence agencies that work closely with the Federal Department of Homeland Security. And this was a very controversial development after 9/11. Every U.S. state, I believe, has at least one. A few states have more than one. And the idea is that they are going to share intelligence between local law enforcement and federal intelligence and law enforcement. Very little was known about these agencies. So I started filing requests. Like I said before, whenever something is national security, they will, pull every trick of the book to try to say, oh, this is going to cause the next 9/11. This is going to, we're going to endanger people if we release these sorts of things. So I ended up having to go to state court in Florida because they have like 3 fusion centers there. So we sued over it, and I was able to get a long list of what are called intelligence products are. That is, the intelligence they're producing, really what these fusion centers do. And what, while I was at The Nation, and you guys can find this story if you just Google fusion centers, Ken Klippenstein, The Nation. What it really showed is that they weren't doing a whole lot. They were, what was pitched to us, bear in mind, these fusion centers were established after 9/11, post 9/11. They were sort of forged in the fires of, all of this public fear and panic about what could happen next. And so what would you think they're doing, and how do they justify their existence and funding and authorities that they enjoy? They say, oh, we're going to prevent the next 9/11. We're going to keep eyes on terrorists. You look at these intelligence products, straight down the list, it was things as frivolous as some guy spilled oil on his neighbor's driveway. And that was what that's what the fusion center was looking at. Another one was they were tracking some rap group around because they were afraid that the rap group, some hip hop group, had some terrorist sympathies or something. Just completely ridiculous stuff, straight down. And the vast majority of it looking like, these very frivolous sort of things that I think whatever you think of fusion centers, I don't think the public had that in mind. when they're told, here's how much of our taxes we're going to invest in them each year. And so finally able to shed light on what the heck these things even do. And I got these records back from a bunch of different fusion centers, and to my knowledge, nobody had really gone through those sorts of things. But in part because it's such a headache, because they throw so many of these exemptions back at you. But in the context of a court, it becomes harder for them to make these sort of ridiculous cases because the judge is sitting there and it's like, come on, guys, this isn't. It's not going to end the republic if you tell them just the title of what this document is, or give them a general idea of what they're up to. But I've had so many different experiences with FOIA, it's hard to really, and another one that I was really happy with, and I thought was kind of instructive about how FOIA tends to go, was during the Trump administration, I sent a FOIA request to the U.S. Embassy in Israel to see their communications about the Palestinian Authority, because Trump had done something he had done that upset a lot of people, even on the right, in the political establishment, was cut all sorts of aid and assistance to the Palestinian Authority. And the concern was not that necessarily that Palestinians are going to suffer, certainly on the part of the establishment in Washington. Their concern is this could lead to instability, because if they don't have money to eat, people are not going to be happy, and they can cause unrest and things like that. Obviously, I'm concerned about like human things, and I'm sure most people are concerned about the human rights aspect, but there are unfortunately other things that the establishment is worried about. And so what I ended up getting back was shocking. It was the communications between the U.S. Embassy and the Israeli Ministry of Defense, in which a high-level defense minister in the Israeli government himself was saying this and raising a red flag about how dangerous these cuts to the Palestinian Authority are. And this is coming straight from the Israeli government, so you can't say that I'm somehow being anti-Israel or something to oppose these cuts. This is the Israeli military themselves saying, guys, there's going to be defense and national security consequences if we don't, give them some pittance to allow them to survive off of. And again, I don't have inside knowledge of this, but I would imagine that there is some degree of the Israeli embassy thinking, gosh, if we release this, it'll at least draw some attention how crazy this decision is, and then the American public will see what's going on. So there's when you get in a very politicized territory, it's not always as hopeless as people think. There are often conflicts within the power centers that run the government. Again, they're not monolithic. They're often fighting with each other in bitter disagreement over policy and strategic objectives, and you can exploit that as a requester.
Hey everyone, this is Ken with you guys live. I'm looking at the set of questions that you all sent. I appreciate those. Noticing a common theme among them is how you know what documents exist. And that really is the crux of the problem. And I'm glad you guys are asking that, because I think that that indicates that you understand really what the challenge is to reporters when they're using the Freedom of Information Act. And long story short, finding out what exists, I think by design, is one of the ways that they prevent things from becoming public, because the vast majority of records intrinsic to any system, it doesn't matter whether it's a government agency. Think about any business you've worked at and the records management system that they use. It's probably peculiar to that specific institution. And in the same way, FBI has its own system, ATF has its own system, ICE has its own system, in a number of different respects. And familiarizing yourself with those, what they're called, I think is the best thing you can do to find out what it is that you want to ask for. Because as I said in the intro video, it's a bit of a misnomer to call it the Freedom of Information Act. We have a Freedom of Records Act, I always say, and you have to know what those records are called. You can come to it with a good faith effort saying, I would like to learn about X. And unfortunately, under relevant case law, they're under they have no responsibility to help you learn the answers to those questions unless you can tell them very specifically a sort of itemized list of data that you want. And there's two elements to this. One is that institutionally it's cheaper to run it that way, because then they don't have to go out and do research. Of course, it is going to result in fewer records being released. And then the second thing is that, these agencies the FOIA offices tend to be underfunded and understaffed. And as I described before, getting into that simple processing track is going to be what's going to determine whether you get things back in a matter of days or weeks instead of months and years. And the way that the FOIA custodians are going to decide which one goes into which track is largely going to be how specific is this person's request. So I would say that that is the number one thing to worry about, is how are you going to make your request as specific as possible and as likely as possible to be placed in that simple processing track. So now I'm going to answer some of these questions more specifically, having addressed what I think is kind of the element common to a lot of them. Looking at the first one from Madeline Jans, it says, what tools have you learned to ensure that you can translate government lingo and official documents from FOIA into stories that every reader can understand? To be straight with you, you have to talk to people. You've got to pick up the phone and talk to sources. And, when I was starting out and I was in my early 20s, that was intimidating, but you quickly realize, particularly if you target retired folks, there are a lot of pensioners, maybe they're still consulting, and they have a whole lot of time on their hands. A lot of them are empty nesters. They care deeply about these agencies. Very few of them, in my experience. Of course, I focus on the national intelligence, national security world. When they leave, they still are following things. They keep in touch with people on the inside. They follow news. They have opinions about how things could be run better. And another thing that they have in vast quantities is free time. And I'm always amazed by the generosity of a lot of these folks, not all of them, but a lot of them, in being able to tell the press, because invariably, even, yourselves, you guys can probably think of cases where you've seen news reporting and thinking, why don't they cover this? Or why don't they look at this? Or I wish they'd, pursue this differently. Well, a lot of these retired folks in these agencies have those exact same feelings. And if you can position yourself as someone to give voice to that and to be able to respond to their concerns and to desires for there to be more, transparency on X, Y, and Z, then they'll be more than willing to help you. And so talking to those folks, generating human intelligence and moving away from what I think is this cult of open source everything, Google and I'm not saying open source approaches are not helpful. I'm saying that when this sort of monolithic focus on what you can find on Google or what you can find on the open web comes at the expense of developing and cultivating relationships with actual humans, you're going to miss out on all sorts of information. And with respect to FOIA, the information that you need to find out what the records you're looking for are called. I cannot tell you how many times I've been talking to a retired diplomat or a retired intelligence officer or retired military officer who they'll mention something offhand and I say, well, how would I learn about that? And they'd be like, oh, we have a quarterly, they'll have some, acronym that makes no sense. If you ever talk to people in DOD, it's like alphabet soup, everything. They can't, nothing is common English. Everything is, you got to look at the, you've got to look at the SITREP 17. They do one of these quarterly and it'll tell you the X, Y, and Z. Unless you talk to these guys, you're never going to, even Googling them, how would you think to, I cannot stress enough the mirage that is this open information that exists. Because even if it's out there somewhere in Google, how are you going to find it? It's really hard. There is just so much information, so overwhelming, that just digging through it all on your own is just in many cases futile. You've got to have a guide. It's like you're, climbing the Himalayas. You don't just go it alone. You have someone that's familiar with it, telling you, what to avoid, tips and tricks, that kind of thing. And these retired guys are so generous, they're very often so generous with their time and happy to do that. So please try to find people familiar with the agencies that you are reporting on. They'll be more than happy to answer these kind of things for you. And they themselves might point you to a lot of open source stuff, but they'll know where it's located already. And that's how you find the names of these things. I mentioned an example in the intro video of the Office of the Chief of Protocol. That is the level of obscurity that you're dealing with in a lot of these agencies. I had no idea what that was. I could Google and try to find out where they keep gifts located. But, the way reporting tends to be written for general audiences. And so it tends to be, it tends towards the big picture general stuff and not the getting into the weeds. Well, these guys that work there, they will be able to get in the weeds and they'll talk your ear off about all these things. So really talk to these folks to find out and to translate the government lingo that, you can run these documents by and say, what the heck does this mean? They'll say, oh, that's a, common classification insignia that we use for such and such. So really start to develop relationships with people and pick up the damn phone. That is so important. Ashley Hopkins asks, when you get these documents, are there limits to what you can share? No, all of it that's been disclosed to you is perfectly legal to share. There are cases where they'll accidentally share things with you. that they're not supposed to. And that happens non-frequently. For example, recently somebody FOIA'd Jeffrey Epstein's flight logs from, I think, the FAA, and they released a whole bunch of things that they weren't supposed to release. And they quickly asked, please send it back. Now, legally, you don't actually have to do that. But on the other hand, there are sometimes ethical considerations. You might not want to, violate anyone's privacy for reasons for which there is not a public interest justification. In those cases, you can, just use common sense to think about, what is morally justifiable or not. But there's certainly no recourse under the law for them to be able to keep you from reporting what they've disclosed to you. Let's see. Allie McCadden asks, how do you stay on top of when certain documents will be released so you can FOIA when the information is new? Do you set reminders for yourself? That's a great question. I do. I have a calendar that for many types of requests are going to be documents that are produced on a routine basis that you can routinely ask for them for. So for example, there will be quarterly reports. There will be annual studies that they have to conduct, that they, particularly ones that they send to Congress, are always good targets. And again, talking to folks will tell you what those are, talking to people on the congressional committees and just asking them, what kind of reports does X agency have for you? And then you can go and ask for those reports once they've been produced. But setting reminders is really helpful, because there's no way you'll quickly learn in FOIA if you try to remember it all in your head and don't have some system of organization. You're going to fall on your face. It's too hard. And, the smartest person in the world couldn't juggle all of the different minutia that you have to when you're running these requests, or even just stuff that seems quotidian, like public affairs officers, the kind that respond to media queries, the press flags. You can ask for those every quarter too. And, or catalogs of FOIA requests. Those are obviously going to be produced on an ongoing basis. In many cases, they don't post them proactively on their websites. So yeah, just set up some kind of calendar or system to give you reminders every 6 months, every year, whatever the case may be for, how these things are produced, because that's really the only way you're going to survive if you're intending to do this, with any sort of depth. Let's see here. What kind of names? Ree Wolfshan asks, how do you know what the names or labels of the documents you're looking for are? What if you're looking for a keyword, or you want to look at meeting logs? Don't you have to be hyper-specific? Yes, you've got to be hyper-specific about everything. And in fact, don't send these out blind. Try to establish a relationship with the FOIA officer. And you can frame it in a way that's both true and likely to enhance the likelihood that you'll get things back in an expedited and meaningful fashion by saying, hey, look, I want to make this easy for you so that, I can get my records quickly, and so that it's easy for you to produce. And again, I'm trying to drive home this point about the human dimension to all of this, which is that they're people at the end of the day. They have institutional allegiances. They have bosses breathing down their necks. But at the same time, if you get to know them, they're gonna be like, oh, that guy seems all right. And they see your request come across, and they're going to say, well, he talked to me. He tried his best to structure this in a way that's easy for me. I'm going to try to help him out here. So try to negotiate with them and talk to them and figure out, how do I do something that's going to be practicable for you to produce in the short term? That will really, up your chances of getting things back. And for finding out the keywords, you can just ask them. Say to the FOIA officer, okay, I think it's this, is there any way I could be more specific, or what would you call that? And they'll, they're often quite helpful about this sort of things. Essentially the same question from Nuha Abdesalam. When requesting FOIA, how specific does one have to be? Well, you don't have to be specific, but for best results, you sure do. So try to impose not just specificity of the document types, but a date range where it's located. It's going to be likely to be located in X field office, such and such special agent so-and-so had access to it. So, and again, if you're asking, how do I find that out? Again, you have to talk to people. These things are not going to be sitting on Google. Cody Bloomfield asks, especially in national security, government agencies play name games. I'm thinking about the efforts to find additional documentation for the FBI's Black Identities Extremist label. Do you look for synonyms? How do you think about shedding light? I mean, again, not to sound like a broken record, but talking to FBI officials who are retired, going on LinkedIn, Googling people that give interviews so that you know that they're people that interface with the press, and just looking at people that focus on domestic extremism. They're going to know the answer to these questions in a way that both Google and your own a priori common sense are not going to be able to, because they've worked in them for a number of years, and they'll know what the new nomenclature is. They will know how things are changing. They will hear from friends still on the inside, in new directions in which the agencies are taking these things. So again, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, just talk to them, and they'll know what these things are that you should focus on. Cody Bloomfield asks, I imagine Fusion Center FOIA requests were challenging given how many agencies are involved. How do you manage FOIA requests when there's complexity embedded in which agency might have which records? Yes, it was very hard, because there's not just the Federal Freedom of Information Act. All 50 states have their own state level interpretation of the FOIA that governs state records. In the case of Fusion Centers, it's kind of confusing because they interact and interface with the federal agencies like the Department of Homeland Security, but legally they're state agencies. So in each of those cases, when I litigated them, I had to use lawyers barred for practice within that state. And not just that, if you go, I would encourage people to use muckrock.com for a quick and easy summary of each state's relevant FOIA statutes, because they're not called FOIA. So it'll be like the California Sunshine Act, or the the Florida Open Records Law, or what I'm just making up examples. But and they'll all differ a little bit. They'll have different deadlines. They'll have different records that are even exposed to FOIA. And familiarizing yourself with those things takes just 2 minutes to go on Muckrock, and they'll have a quick FAQ answering these kind of things. Will help you enormously in being able to craft these requests to the different state agencies. To answer a question about if the records are centralized, no, they're not. They might send them to the Department of Homeland Security, but then they have a whole complicated legal regime around how those still technically belong to the state agency. So long story short is, if you're dealing with it, make sure you're going to want to know if what you're looking at is federal or state. And if it's state, familiarize yourself with the rules governing that state's FOIA process. Zuri Pope says, you've extensively reported on Amazon and its internal dynamics. How does reporting a corporation compare to a government agency? How is cultivation of sources different? That's a very good question. So FOIA really shows the problem with allowing, the extent of productive activities in the United States be governed by private bodies, because there's no presumption of transparency beyond the, maybe annual or quarterly report to investors. None of that, you can't FOIA a corporation. And so the process by which you go about learning is very different. In my case, there was an outrage about, I think it was factory conditions. I just did a call out for tips from people that worked at Amazon. It can be challenging because you have to verify that the tips are real and that they're not trolls. And they're the way you go about doing that is maybe you ask them for a badge at the place that they work for, and then you check their phone number to make sure it matches the name they've given you. There's any number of common sense ways you can make sure that who you're talking to is who you say that you're talking to. But that's a much different. I would say that the human element becomes even more important in those cases, because there is no presumption of transparency for corporations in U.S. law. And so essentially everything they do is secret. In some ways you can learn more about the CIA than you can about ExxonMobil, because at least the CIA declassifies things over time, and at least in principle, you're able to request information from them. When it comes to businesses, none of that exists. It's sort of extraordinary. People aren't more frustrated by that. I mean, why do they have the right to operate in total secrecy? I don't understand. I mean, these huge corporations that exert power on the level of some federal agencies, I don't know, but that's the legal regime that we have. Just gotta make sure I'm not going to go over time here. Let's see here. How do you contend with redactions and FOIA requests? Now, this is very important. Appeal almost everything. It doesn't hurt to appeal. All it takes is time. Time would be the only reason that you wouldn't want to do it. And to write a FOIA appeal is very simple. Just look at something. If something's over redacted, try to challenge them on some basis. And there's usually a pretty narrow time frame when you can appeal something. I think at the federal level, it's about 90 days after you receive your records release, and you can go on appealing things indefinitely. In my experience, one quick appeal that kind of tries to make a case for, look, come on, guys, this whole section is blacked out, and you didn't explain what the redaction is. clearly some of that, like I assume not all of it is going to be exempt under, whatever exemption. Very often, they'll give you a little bit more. And so in my experience, that's really important because if you, I know from people that work in the FBI office, they have a sign up that says, when in doubt, black it out. And when you have that kind of attitude for the first release of documents, appealing things to the appellate authority within the agency can often, they'll give you maybe 10% more, 15% more, and say, come on, guys, let's be a little bit more reasonable here. So few people appeal that you'll often find results when you pursue that course. So I want to thank you guys for joining me and for your questions, which I was impressed with. I think that you guys really understand what's relevant about FOIA, which is that specificity and how to find out what they're called. So have a nice weekend and take care, everyone.